Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the first of 3 seminars for uplifting contextual and experiential evidence. We are so excited to have you today and to share with you what we've been learning and get your thoughts on it. So, as I said, one of the webinars, the first one called Strategies to Strengthening Evidence-Based Decision Making.
Our agenda for today is going to look like introductions and welcome. Then we'll move into background on uplifting contextual and experiential evidence, the project as a whole. We'll discuss proposed principles and strategies. And throughout the webinar, we're going to be collecting feedback from you all via Zoom polling. So I really encourage you all to just share freely anything that resonates, anything that applies to your work. We'll be providing guided questions, so don't worry about trying to keep track of any of that, but there will be plenty of opportunity for your feedback. And then we will be closing out the session. Next slide, please. The objectives are to review findings from the UC landscape scan for a balanced paradigm of valuing and integrating evidence for decision-making for funding, strategies, policies, programs, and long-term planning, and to provide feedback on the proposed principles and strategies and what to include in the Uplifting Contextual and Experiential Evidence Best Practices and Recommendations report. So before we start, I want to introduce the Prevention Institute team that is hosting the webinar and working on the UC project as a whole. We have Sheila Savannah, the managing director, Ruben Cantu, program director, Bubudi Kacholia, program coordinator, and me, Sophia Bateo, program assistant. This is a project that is supported by CDC's Division of Violence Prevention. So just want to share the COAG slide before we get into it. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Ruben.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. Really excited to see so many people here today. So I just want to give a little bit of background on why we're doing this and where this is coming from, and share a little bit about how this project is happening within the context of a couple of other happenings or learnings over the last couple of years. So first and foremost, I'm sure many of you realize or have heard about evidence-based programs, evidence-based policies, projects, and practices, and how this term, evidence-based, is increasingly used in the field of public health and the field of violence prevention, and kind of all the places we do our work. Requiring evidence-based programming or interventions is really showing up a lot more in requests for proposals, both for government funding opportunities as well as from philanthropies and foundations. Another thing is that about 13 years ago, the CDC published a framework for thinking about evidence to give guidance about evidence-based decision-making and described 3 types of evidence in that framework. Best available research evidence, contextual evidence, and experiential evidence. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those mean in just a few moments. But in the meantime, I'm going to drop a link to that framework for thinking about evidence that CDC developed in the chat. And then the other little bit that's important to share is Prevention Institute has built out a body of work over the last several years, working in partnership with CDC on the need to elevate health equity and racial justice in all of our work, but particularly in our community safety and violence prevention work. And a couple of reasons why that's important is because usually communities of color, African American, Latino, Native American, those folks are folks that are usually disproportionately facing challenges around violence in their communities. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not conflating things and talking about that in a way that makes it feel like those folks are the drivers for the violence that we're seeing, but can really be the community can really be the driver for safety in our communities. And so this work and this thinking around the need to further embed health equity and racial justice in our work, particularly in violence prevention and community safety work, led to the development of some online modules around health equity in practice, particularly around violence prevention and community safety. And those are on our website. And I just dropped a link to those as well. And so all of this context has kind of laid the foundation for this current project, which consists of a landscape scan, some subject matter interviews, and a series of 3 webinars, which Vibhuti mentioned earlier. And really what we're hoping to do with this project is to make sure that we can embed uplifting contextual and experiential evidence at the state, at the local, state, and federal levels in the work that we're doing, to kind of balance the over reliance on best available research evidence. And Vibhuti is going to go through a little bit more about what that actually means and what that actually looks like.
So as Ruben mentioned, the framework for thinking about evidence describes 3 forms of evidence that contribute to evidence-based decision-making. There's contextual evidence, best available research evidence, and experiential evidence. So best available research evidence refers to evidence that's produced through scientific inquiry and process, and it primarily describes published, peer-reviewed material measuring design, fidelity, and replicability. And there's contextual evidence, which measures, has measurable factors collected from local data sources, community history, and other localized data, community data, which includes census data, needs and asset assessments, surveys, focus groups, and local administrative data. Lastly, there's experiential evidence, which is the collection of knowledge and experiences of people who have engaged with or lived in communities of interest or have experienced an issue or topic. Experiential evidence is collected through focus groups, interviews, co-designing projects, communities of practice, and community meetings. So here we have a few examples to share with each one of the types of evidences. So although the framework itself describes 3 equal forms of evidence, best available research evidence has been emphasized in decision-making. Scientific methodologies have been put on a pedestal as objective measures that can give unbiased truth with a strict and tested gold standard process. While it has been amplified through guidance and through authority, so alongside this evidence, alongside the framework itself, CDC published additional guidance in assessing and integrating best available research evidence. And traditional research methodologies have exacerbated inequities through bias and limiting diversity of funding of researchers and research areas, which has led to limited funding for collecting health equity data and a lack of granular and disaggregated data.
And so we need to make sure that we're making intentional efforts to uplift contextual and experiential evidence through producing, collecting, utilizing, and sustaining them as a key part of our decision making in the community, and also decision making on the part of decision makers, like people that work for local government, people that work for philanthropies and foundations, to kind of help balance that out. And we need to really ultimately work toward systemic advance, and doing this is going to help us ultimately work toward systemic advancement of health equity and racial justice in the work that we're doing. Next slide. And so the goal of this project is to provide guidance to move toward weaving all 3 of those forms of evidence for a more balanced paradigm of informed decision making. We see all 3 of them as really, really important. Best available research evidence, has to be communicated in a way that really resonates with what people who are most highly impacted are seeing on the ground in their communities, and that needs to be also placed within the context of everything that's happening in a community as well. So all three of those, very, very important. They intertwine in a way that will really give us a more balanced way of making decisions.
So through our landscape scan and our subject matter expert conversations, we've pulled together 4 proposed principles and 13 strategies that look to produce, collect, utilize, and sustain contextual and experiential evidence. So today we're going to broadly be going through the principles and strategies with more technical guidance to come in our final report. And today we want to use our time together to provide feedback and reflect on how these principles and strategies may resonate in your own work. So after each principle, as Sophia mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have a set of multiple choice and short answer questions pop up on your screen through Zoom polling. So look out for those, and we're looking forward to hearing what you think. So the first proposed principle that we have is shifting investment, ownership, and action to community. This principle touches on sustaining contextual and experiential evidence through providing opportunities and resources to produce contextual evidence to ensure that it's available for ongoing decision-making. Beyond funding, this principle calls for community to have ownership and authority over their data and have a continuous and active role in their narrative that is built from their community data. Long-term planning of investing in contextual and experiential evidence ensures that we move towards that more balanced weaving-like paradigm of integrating all forms of evidence into decision-making. And the investing that sort of we're referring to in this principle can be compared to investing in academic researchers and institutions to build and innovate the academic literature and best available research evidence. So that's one way to sort of think about it. So there are 3 strategies under this principle that really we thought exemplified what we were hoping to communicate. So capacity building of institutions, organizations, and community together and separately is necessary to share and bridge knowledge, context, and align priorities between different parties. Building strong community-driven organizations like coalitions and community power building networks is needed to build sustainable relationships between institutions and the community. These groups can go far beyond advocacy to building long-term important infrastructure for engagement and partnership. And the last strategy here is long-term investing. So strategies and mechanisms that are important to provide ongoing and diverse assistance for long-term equity-centered approaches to programming, engagement, and partnership. Because we know this sort of work does not happen overnight. So we need to ensure that we are able to provide and invest in communities and organizations to do this work for long periods of time. So we're to our first Zoom poll. So it's going to pop up on your screen in a second, and we're going to give you a few minutes to answer the questions before moving on to the next principle. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Yeah, and if you all are interested in sharing a little bit about how this first strategy around investment, ownership, and action looks like in your community, please feel free to drop it in the chat, share an example as folks are answering the poll questions. And it looks like as I'm looking at the live polling going on right now, it seems that the strategy around investing in coalition building and community power building is really resonating with folks, as well as ongoing opportunities for capacity building and long-term investing practices and mechanisms is coming in third. And I think that, I would wager that that's probably just because we've got a long way to go in terms of making sure that we're investing in the right kinds of capacity building and community power building. But yeah, it really looks like a lot of investing in coalition building and community power building is really resonating with a vast majority of the folks who are responding to the poll.
We're going to give you about 4 more minutes. So take your time as you're answering. Okay, we are going to wrap up this poll in just a second. So as you're finishing up, we're happy to hear that, Dr. Bitta. Thank you. We're going to go on to the next principle here.
Okay. So the second proposed principle is around practicing meaningful community engagement, which I'm sure a lot of folks on the webinar are familiar with. It's really about understanding community engagement as a systems level process. And making sure that not only are we creating opportunities to collect experiential evidence and and hearing about the experiences of folks living in those communities that are most highly impacted by whatever challenge we're talking about, but also that community engagement and listening to folks can be instrumental in kind of understanding the really dynamic community context that influences community conditions and influences the environment. And it's really important to make sure that we have that in order to have meaningful community engagement, we also establish non-tokenistic community representation and align with community on what qualifies as meaningful. Community is really, these strategies and the input we're trying to get from communities in order to make a very strong push for evidence. Like, we really need to make sure that we're working with community hand in hand to identify like what is meaningful, what kind of input would be important, and to really help understand the context that this data and evidence is coming from. Next slide. Some of the strategies here include making sure that we have representative boards and task forces, advisory bodies that have clear and transparent roles for members, and that also have measurable outcomes and impact from entities, bidirectional benefits for members and institutions, making sure that folks are getting something out of it on both ends, and making sure that this kind of participation is not extractive, but it's really about how can it benefit community members who we're asking to provide their input, their and their time. Practicing distributive leadership through being mindful of who is represented and using equity-focused tools to measure impact and structure of organizations. Participatory budgeting, which is a process in which community members decide how to spend part of a public budget as a way to engage folks and to figure out how success should be measured. And then outreach in the community and meeting people where they are when doing outreach, holding different and creative forms of engagement, thinking outside the box, and tapping into community wisdom and community knowledge to kind of figure out what kind of outreach works, and following a lot of the standards that we usually talk about when we talk about working with community members, making sure that we're providing doing meetings in multiple languages or have interpretation and translation and all of those things that we know are important in order to have a culturally competent, culturally sound process. So on the next slide, we're going to jump into doing kind of another Zoom poll. So, and I just want to make sure that we explain this process a little bit more. We're doing the Zoom polling. We're getting input from you all because we want to make sure that the research that we've done, the information that we've collected, both from doing a landscape scan and from talking to expert community stakeholders across the country, both people that work in research, people that work in community organizations, the folks that we've talked to has really informed some of these strategies we've put out there that we're sharing with you all today. But we want to hear from more folks around, does this make sense? Does this resonate with you all? And are we kind of on the right track to making sure we're identifying some of those best or promising practices around making sure we're balancing out evidence? So many people rely on just, like Vibhuti said, there's this over-reliance on best available research evidence that comes from an academic base. And we want to make sure that it's balanced out with input from community and thinking about community and contextual cues. And as we're putting that body of work out to folks, we want to make sure it resonates with as many folks as we can. So that's why we're asking for this kind of input from you all, to kind of hear if it resonates, hear if it doesn't resonate. So I encourage you all, as you all answer some of these Zoom polling questions, add stuff into the chat, tell us what you're thinking. I think folks might have the ability to unmute. We're going to have a few minutes in between each of these strategies. Unmute and talk to us and share some of your thoughts and input that way as well. We're going to be doing like Vibhuti mentioned, we're going to be doing 2 more of these webinars in the coming months. And during those webinars, we're actually going to be highlighting some of the folks that we spoke to talk a little bit about how they're utilizing different forms of evidence in their community to influence decision makers. So we're going to be talking and spotlighting a mix of folks that work in community for community organizations and how they've used community voice and lived experience. But we're also going to be talking to some researchers. We're also going to be talking to some other decision makers about how they see the importance of community voice and community context in the work that they're doing. So I just wanted to give a little bit more background on like why it is that we're asking all these questions. So please, we're going to launch the Zoom poll. Feel free to ask questions. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. Feel free to unmute if you have a question or if you have a comment or you want to share how this stuff is resonating with you all. I hope that helps to explain a little bit more for folks. So some of the questions from this poll here: which strategies outlined under this proposed principle do you practice in your work currently? Transparent boards and task forces, distributive leadership structures, participatory budgeting activities, and ongoing outreach. Somebody in the question asked, can we define distributive leadership? And basically what we're talking about there is talking about being mindful of who is represented in the group, making sure that if you're bringing together an advisory board, or if you're trying to make sure that you're integrating community voice and community experiences into the work that you're doing, making sure that you're not just bringing in folks and hearing from them in a way that feels tokenistic or in a way that feels like we're being extractive. It means if you're asking people for their opinion on what it takes to run a program and make it really community centered and community focused, actually don't just ask folks for their opinion, but give them the opportunity to lead, share some of the power to be able to make decisions, or make clear what kinds of decisions folks will be able to what kind of decision making power folks will be able to have, and not just bringing them on to be kind of like a passive participant in those activities.
Yeah, one way to think about it also is the difference between getting input and really thinking about where does the decision lie, and to the extent possible, really distributing where those decisions can be made. Good question. I think there was another one about tools.
Right.
I answer that in the chat, but we've done some planning and looking as we did our landscape scan, and we're putting together a list of tools that folks can use in their different situations as they're working with different types of institutions or different types of community groups. And we're looking forward to sharing that in both the third webinar and in our final report.
Really good question. And it looks like here for this first question, a lot of resonance around ongoing outreach in the community. And love to hear some folks drop in the chat what some of the outreach methods they've been using are. We'd love to hear from you all. And then the second question was around who's driving meaningful community engagement in your work. leading the advocacy, things like that. And it looks like a lot of folks are saying community-based organizations, community advocates, and community residents are the folks that are kind of leading that community engagement, which is really great to see, and really great to see that there's a lot of folks kind of calling out, and kudos to those community organizations and advocates and residents who are doing that. And then our third question, which is around kind of looking at a spectrum of your community engagement practices, going from outreach to consulting to involving to collaborating to sharing leadership. It seems like a lot of folks, excuse me, fall around the collaborating end of that spectrum, with consulting and involving also being strongly represented there. So some really good input from folks. We appreciate you. This is kind of a new thing we're doing with Prevention at Prevention Institute, is kind of getting this kind of feedback from you all in real time as we're doing these sessions. So we're kind of learning as we're going, and we really appreciate you all being part of this new effort. We want to make sure that at the end of the day, the work that we're putting out there is really reflective of not only the research we're doing and what we're hearing from the community partners we work with and that we talk to all the time, and it really reflects kind of a broader mix of folks. So really thank you all for that. Let's see, we've got a comment in the chat from Ann Carter. She says they personalize invitations to community members and often have one-on-one conversations to express purpose, gauge interest, gather input for subsequent work. Great. Thanks for sharing that example. Okay.
I think we'll wrap up the poll in around 30 seconds. So get your last answers in and we'll keep moving.
So we will be sending you all a copy of these slides and recording after the fact. If there's folks that you think you would want to, share this with, please feel free to do that. But when we send you that follow-up, it would be really great to hear from you all, any feedback on this process as well.
Thank you, folks. Okay, so we are going to move on to the third principle, and that is elevating lived experience through relationship building. So while you can think about community engagement as a systems level process and creating opportunities to connect with folks, it's important to be connecting with the appropriate individuals and groups and go beyond surface level conversations that focus on experience and proximity to the issue. And these conversations must be navigated with intentionality, mutual benefit, and respect. So especially to elevate lived experience that we're looking for, ongoing and long-term relationship building is essential to collect that relevant and nuanced experience, and making sure that, again, we are working with folks who have proximity to the programs, the policies, or the practices that we're looking to learn more about. So there are 3 strategies under this principle. And the first strategy here is to engage in authentic partnership, which can look like establishing accountable and transparent relationships through mechanisms like memorandum of understandings or other real clear-cut contracts to ensure clear and defined roles and expectations. Alongside these roles and expectations, there must be an explicit and mindful conversation around power dynamics of different folks who are in relation with each other, and a clear demonstration of commitment and values. To reach the right people that we are hoping to reach and to understand their lived experience,
we must be reaching out to a representative sample. And this starts with working with the community to define who the population of focus really is. And from there, we use equitable sampling methods and multilingual tools to ensure that we are connecting with them. And then lastly, it's important to gather lived experience beyond our inner circle. In this work that we do, we have so many close allies and colleagues who share the lived experiences with the populations of focus. It is imperative to reach beyond this inner circle, to lift up lived experiences from diverse groups of people to broaden the scope of insight and feedback. This is essential because a singular individual's lived experience does not represent the entire community or system. And we want to make sure that we're not reaching out to the same groups of people or the same individuals in a community that are leaders. They have so much to offer, but they also can connect us with their broader circles and communities to make sure we're getting a diverse and nuanced understanding of what's happening on the ground. So those are the 3 strategies under this proposed principle. So again, back to the Zoom polling, we'll put that up for you in a second. And we're excited to hear about your insights on this one. So alongside asking you about the strategies and which ones resonate with you in your work, we've also adapted a few rules from a report called Methods and Emergent Strategies to Engage People with Lived Experiences. And they outline these five roles of folks that you can connect with to gather lived experience from. And we'd love to hear about who you're connecting with to gather your lived experience work from or in your work. And then lastly, asking about your greatest challenges while elevating lived experience.
And Vibhuti, there's a request in the chat to back up to the slide with the definition.
Let me go back. And we'll send out the PowerPoint shortly after this presentation. As well, if you have any questions on what I've showcased, please let me know.
And I'll share with folks and encourage folks to share in the chat also. But I will admit that I've often found myself guilty of not following the third strategy there, gathering lived experience beyond like our inner circle. Because I think all of us face this every once in a while. Like we have certain people that we always go to for feedback, whether it's like within our organization, within like our circle of community partners. And we have to be really conscious of the fact that we might be going back to the same people over and over again. And then that starts feeling like a very extractive, one-sided relationship. And you might be going to that one person because you know that they represent a specific or you might have it in your mind that they represent a specific community, and you end up falling into that trap of being of like falling into the trap of like being tokenistic because you're going back to the same person that you're like, okay, I know I can go to this person because they represent indigenous populations, and you kind of find yourself realizing, oh shoot, I've been doing these things that we kind of like counsel people not to do. So I just wanted to share, like, I've had that personal realization with these things, and it's and if folks that try to be very community centered and community conscious do it, it's really easy for folks that don't have that lens and don't have that perspective. It's so much easier for them to kind of fall into those traps as well. Um, so your input and your feedback here, especially if you're folks who have no idea who we are and like, somebody forwarded you this and said this sounds like something you might be interested in, we really appreciate your feedback as well, because I think we're always looking to expand our inner circle of folks. There's a lot of folks on this webinar that I know, that we know collectively, but there's a lot of people that I've never met, and I'm like really glad to be able to hear and get your input on some of this stuff as well. So it looks like the authentic partnerships question is getting a lot of response here, a lot of resonance from folks. And then around who you connect to for that lived experience, um, pretty even from all the way through, from storytellers to advisors to partners and staff and grantees. It seems like we're kind of tapping into a wide range of folks in different roles. So we really appreciate having that, hearing that from you all, that we're kind of on the right track here.
I want to draw some attention to what's happening in the chat and share that it's realized that it's difficult to build authentic relationships with a single meeting per month, addressing that being connecting one-on-one between meetings. It takes time and energy. Payback is worth it. Absolutely. And I think that's what we're referring to in terms of this relationship building, right? Making sure that we are building genuine and investing time into these relationships to ensure that we're not sort of having extractive one-off conversations.
Yeah, and then somebody else in the chat saying, my organization really struggles with expanding the inner circle if we can't compensate people for their time. But that this is also helping to realize the harms of not engaging at all and the inherent equity challenges of asking for time, energy, and sharing without some kind of compensation. Really, really true. Yeah, somebody else sharing again that this past year was the first time to use stipends in a public health setting. And Dr. Beto saying funding is an issue, maintaining long-term duration needed to build partnerships. Really, really important there. Yeah, insufficient funding is the root of all deficiencies in these areas. Yeah. Health departments losing a lot of funding, especially a lot of the funding that came as a result of COVID and the ARPA Recovery Plan Act funding. Very, very true. Makes it harder.
We're going to wrap up this poll in just around 10 seconds. So finish what you're writing, and then we'll move on to the last principle. Andrew says, we lost a lot of funding in health departments, but we are resilient. Absolutely.
Okay, so the fourth principle here is around identifying community measures and indicators. We're talking about describing community characteristics that go beyond individual level data points to show kind of the overarching trends in a community. So kind of broadening the type, the scope, and the breadth of evidence that is used in decision making. And then thinking about producing data that illustrates a cohesive and nuanced picture of community assets and gaps. Changing the way that one of the things that we've been big proponents of is changing the way we kind of talk about community needs assessments and moving from having it be just about needs and having it be about community assets and strengths as well. So thinking about creative methodologies that kind of get us a little bit more deeper insight into community conditions and community contexts. And because these this really helps us broaden the evidence base. And because these measures and indicators are not bound to traditional scientific methods, we can employ these kinds of like creative methodologies to kind of help us get better and broader and deeper insight. Next slide. So some of the strategies here include having local assessments that are tailored to community-specific contexts, infrastructure, and preferences to make sure we've got that kind of right level of baseline measures and assets in the community. Practicing narrative data by weaving quantitative measures and storytelling. One of the folks that we talked to and a close partner of ours that we work with, Aristeo Salisbury, who's the co-executive director of the McKinleyville Family Resource Center in Humboldt County, California, said, data points are topic sentences and the stories help explain what they mean. And that really kind of like, when she said that, it was kind of like that truth bomb that kind of dropped on us, right? It was like really kind of making it clear to us why it's important to have the data along with the stories, because without the stories, that data is just, it's just a data point, and it is kind of out there without any of that context, and the narrative, the storytelling, the lived experience really helps to add that context. And then investing in methodology, explicitly using tools and frameworks and data collection, analysis, engagement that will help us to get to the right health equity and racial justice outcomes. And even though they are discrete variables, it's important to work toward defined goals and outcomes. And so there's a couple of examples we list here, or one example we list here, which is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, or GARE, for those of you all that are familiar. Their racial equity toolkit kind of like has some of this information in there that would be a helpful resource for folks to tap into. So we're gonna move into our last and final. No, it's not our final. We're gonna tap into another Zoom polling portion, and that's gonna the poll is gonna pop up. Take your time and answer some of those questions for us related to this last strategy around identifying community measures and indicators. We've kind of put up the strategies again for folks to be able to look at. Tell us which ones of those do you practice in your current work, and share some examples of community measures and indicators that your organization is using in its decision making. And what are some of the biggest challenges that you've faced in identifying community measures and indicators? And I'm going to go back to the chat because it looks like we've had a couple of things drop. Yet somebody mentioned if the guide was available yet, and we're in the process. Sophia answered that question. We're in the process of developing the final report. Getting this input from you all is a really important part of the process of finalizing our report. So we're going to be sharing the information from this webinar. We're going to be having the other two webinars coming up soon. And then later on this summer, we're going to release our report. And anybody who's been part of these webinars, you'll be on the email list to receive the report when it comes out. Let's see. Sean in Houston, love the flip to focus on growing community assets versus deficit-minded assessment of communities. Yes, we're really big fans of doing that. And Sierra, I have a great example of this process. Check out the Sidewalks to Sexual Violence Prevention a guide to social inclusion with people with cognitive and development disabilities. And she shared the link. Thank you for sharing that. So please take time and answer the poll. I'm like, I can't tell you how thrilled I am that we have as many participants as we do on a webinar around data and evidence, and that we've kind of maintained the number of folks that are in the webinar the whole time. We've had the number of participants hovering between 68 and 71 the entire time, and seeing seeing that number remain steady as we share what I think other people would consider dry, really kind of like really amazing to see. And I can promise you, not that I think what we're sharing is dry. I think we're trying to make this as exciting as possible. But the next couple of webinars are going to have some of those guest speakers talking about experiences in the community. And I think those are going to be, that's going to amp up the excitement a little bit more. So definitely encourage you all to come back for the next series and to share it with your colleagues. Sierra getting a big kudos from our colleague here at Prevention Institute, Lisa. Another comment around loving the narrative approach. The biggest challenge we run into is power holders valuing rigor more than qualitative data, or wanting info that is generalizable when the effort being evaluated is intended to be generalizable, right? Like, I think we forget a lot of times if we're looking at data and numbers, that those data and numbers are people. Like, we're talking about real people, and we need to provide that context and give kind of that background. And then somebody else just giving us a shout out saying that this is a great webinar, but has to jump off. So we're going to give a couple more minutes for folks to answer some of these polling questions, and then we'll move on to the last little bit of feedback that we're going to ask from you all, and then we'll be able to wrap up the session. So it seems like, yeah, the narrative approach is the one that seems to be resonating with most, with a lot of folks. Really glad to hear that.
We're going to give you around 2 more minutes for this. I know the short answer questions can take a second to write, so we're just going to give you about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. Okay, about 10 more seconds. Wrap up. Submit the poll. Okay. Thank you so much. So this is actually leading us to our last feedback. So as we pull up that poll once again for the last time, we're also going to talk a little bit about our next steps and what to expect from us. So I'll have Sophia pull that chat up. Some of these questions are some ranking questions and things, but we'd love to hear about your insight on any previous guidance you've had on uplifting contextual and experiential evidence in decision making, asking about where you assess public health and allied sectors in weaving together all three forms of evidences, and what institutions you believe are most pivotal in driving this change of weaving all forms of evidences into decision making, ranking what you believe are, out of the 4 principles we've shared today, are the most essential in changing practices in decision making, and the barriers you think must be solved to uplift different types of evidence in decision making. What sorts of investments would you like to see to drive this work forward? So as you're answering those questions, seeing some great conversation in the chat about how narrative is not for the faint of heart. Absolutely takes a lot of hard work. You have to be attentive and have to be a commitment, and it can be draining. Absolutely, it can. It's difficult to be able to weave the two together. Dr. Beda, would you like to speak on that?
Yeah, just it really is. I think bridging the two. What we think and what we feel. That's a huge, huge challenge, and in a lot of ways, each of them, like science. I mean, it's a lot easier for me to sit here and come up with questions, come up with a survey, do an ANOVA, and it's all very, 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 very easy. And you avoid all of the implications and context around the work. So yeah, it's just it does I think and not for the faint of heart. You just really have to in my opinion, something we didn't talk about here is doing this kind of work. I strongly encourage people to have some kind of belief system, some kind of spiritual life that keeps them sustained through the hard work. Something that seldom gets talked about, but I think is important.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Dr. Beton.
So as you're filling out this final feedback, we also want to share about our upcoming next session, which is going to be about integrating and weaving evidences into practice. We're really excited to have Fariha Waheed from the Baltimore Trauma Informed Care Task Force and Dr. Catherine Bocanegra from the University of Illinois, Chicago, come and speak to us about the sort of work that they're doing in their community and how they've been able to weave these forms of evidences into practice, into decision-making, what have been the sort of successes they've seen, the challenges that they've run into. Really excited for that. That's going to be on May 29th. At the same time, Sophia just dropped the registration link in the chat. So if you'd like to come and join us there, we would really appreciate you coming and listening in. Thank you. Any additional questions, things like that, please put them in the chat. But thank you so much for joining us in this session. We'll keep this going for another few minutes for you to fill out your final feedback, but we really appreciate your time, your attentiveness, and your care as we presented this work to you for your consideration.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Like we've said, you'll get slides and recording as well. You can share that out with folks that you think would benefit from hearing this. And as we kind of get closer to finalizing our report, we will make sure that everybody that's on this list that not only attended but registered for the session and wasn't able to participate, that you all get copies of that. Thank you all.
Excellent job. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
Feel free to take some time back after you filled out the last feedback, and we are looking forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you. Okay. I'm gonna close out the poll now. Okay. Still around, I believe you are part of our feedback session. I'm just gonna stop my sharing for a second. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm gonna give us a minute, get your things set up, and we'll sort of get into questions and things from there. Thank you for sticking around till the end and speaking with us after the webinar. We appreciate it. Leo, we know that there was some scheduling things, but we're happy that you're here and that you got the right time and the right place.
Yeah, no worries.
Hi, Britt.
Hello.
Hi, Colleen.
And Vibuti, I asked Katie to stay too.
Awesome. She can hang out too. We'll do a round of introductions before we get going. We have Bernadette here. Okay. So great to see you all. Before we get into questions and things, we'd love to introduce ourselves a little bit more, introduce to each other, and go from there. So I can go first. I'm Vibhuti. I'm a program coordinator at Prevention Institute based out in Oakland. I'll pass it to Ruben.
I'm Ruben, also with Prevention Institute based out of our Oakland office. Thank you all for joining us. Sheila?
Ruben, you broke up a little for me. I'm
Oh.
Sheila Savannah, also with the Prevention Institute. I'm in our Houston office. And I'll pass it on to Sophia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia. I'm a program assistant for Prevention Institute's Safety and Wellbeing team. I am also in our Oakland, or based out of the Oakland office. Katie?
Hi, all. I'm Katie Miller. I'm an associate program director based out of our Oakland office. I am not part of the project team for this project, but I co-lead our organization's impact and metrics work. So I'm stopping by to chat and hear more about this work. I will pass to Leo.
Hi, everyone. Leo Lopez with the National Compadres Network. Our main office is actually headquartered in San Jose, California, but I reside and work out of Yakima, Washington, in Washington State.
Nice.
And I'm the director with the National Compadres Network. And I'll pass it to, I don't know if Bernadette has gone yet or not.
We can go to Britt, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, all. Britt Higgins, she, her. I'm with the Office of Policy and Planning in the California Department of Public Health, and a contributor on the Violence Prevention Initiative, that works with the Prevention Institute. I live in Oakland, although technically my headquarters is in Sacramento. And I'll pass it to Colleen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Colleen Yeakel, and I'm an evaluator with the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I get to be part of a team these days because we do so much listening. We center listening to community in developing our strategy, both intervention and prevention. So that is a happy place to be in right now. We're located in Indianapolis, our offices. I am located in beautiful Bloomington, Indiana.
Wonderful. So wonderful to meet you all. Thank you again for responding to our requests and staying after to get some additional feedback from all of you and to sort of talk about the webinar. Bernadette, if you have a chance, you can introduce yourself in the chat. No worries. So I'm going to share my screen quickly, and I'm going to put up these discussion questions. And we'll start off with the first one. And after, taking a second to look at, I'll actually stop sharing and then put them in the chat as well. But I do want to start with what stood out to you or resonated with you from the proposed principles that we shared.
I can start. First I wanted to say I'm honored and surprised to be invited to share feedback. I feel like I'm definitely not an expert in this. But yeah, happy to share what resonated with me. I think a lot of things, but something that was a through line for me is how important it is to have sustained funding, and we need a lot of time to be intentional and do this right. And so for me, investment and long-term funding, flexible funding was something that undergirds our ability to be able to do all of these things. And so, yeah, I really appreciated the final questions about who are the most important stakeholders or partners in pushing this work forward. And so, yeah, I was thinking a lot about the role of philanthropy in this and the CDC. So often our funding streams are very limited in scope. They're limited term, and it makes it really hard to do this work in a thoughtful, intentional way. So yeah.
I'll go next. Ditto to all that for sure. And in addition to that, I think what also stood out, at least for me, is the power of the coalition building, and how important that really is and critical and needed, in the way things are set up now, in trying to, get funding, for example. It's always difficult to come up with evidence-based data in order to access that funding. And so I think everything that you pointed out around that is important to continue to discuss and strategize around how do we blend the diverse data that is out there so that it's used in a way that's equitable, and in particular to BIPOC, professionals, right, as well as the communities, because often we get overlooked in the lived experience data, et cetera, that when we submit, for example, for grants or proposals, it's hard to include that data at times if it's not acknowledged or recognized as being at that same level that I think Ruben had spoke to early on when he was presenting this morning. So those are some of my thoughts.
I would affirm both of those ideas. I think I felt just very excited. I feel gushy. I felt very excited about the conversation because I read that document from CDC in 2013 and have tried to honor it in our practice. And that has felt very uphill, where funding streams are not funding community-based wisdom. They're not accessible to applicants. You need a team of MPH experts to interpret a lot of the NOFOs that are coming down. So support for honoring community-based wisdom has felt like a missing piece. In my current CDC grant, story, narrative, qualitative data are not valued. They're not collected. So I have appreciated that Venn diagram and tried to live into it. I haven't seen that supported through funding. I haven't seen that supported through a lot of research and evaluation of community-based strategy and wisdom. So those are the things that I'd like to see on the back end to really make it genuinely available.
Absolutely. And I think one of the goals of this project is to not only inform folks who are working in the field about the three forms of evidences, but also going back to the CDC. Like, this is what you shared with us in 2013. You've sort of left us a gap in guidance for these two other types of evidences. Here's sort of like a wake-up call in bringing back attention and awareness to these two. Absolutely. Hi, Bernadette. No worries at all. Would you like to introduce yourself? And then I just put the first question into the chat. Oh, I'm unable to hear you. I don't know.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, I had the wrong mic set up. That's never happened before. Weird. Thank you so much. My name is Bernadette Dolan. I am the Rape Prevention Education Program Director for the State Health Department. So the thoughts that I'm having and are really resonating with me right now are around how to do this work better as a funder. And sometimes I struggle to interpret guidance documents that are meant for community-based organizations, and then to think about, like, what does that mean for us? How do we make sure we're supporting and funding these things versus when do we need to set up our own advisory committees, or when is it referring to, like, how much budget, participatory budgeting should we be doing? So I struggle with understanding, like, how much should we be making sure we're supporting our partners in doing versus how much should we be doing ourselves as funders as well? And when is it, sometimes it's not appropriate for us to do it. Like, community needs assessments, we feel like, at least in our program, should really be done by our partner organizations, not by us. So that's something that I'm trying to understand better right now myself.
That's really interesting. And I'm happy that you brought that up, because I think that's something that we're hoping to connect with the full report. But it's nice to hear all these different perspectives we have in this room as community organization folks, as funders, as State Department. So awesome to hear. And like Colleen said in the chat as well. So our next question here is about proposed, out of the proposed principles that we've shared and the strategies, if you have experience in implementing them, if you have, what have you found most challenging? And if you haven't implemented them, as we've described or something similar, we'd love to hear about that as well. And if not, maybe why not? What maybe do you think are the challenges to approach some of these strategies? Because it's not easy work. I will say, like, that's definitely there are investments of time and effort and personnel. So yeah.
I can speak to that briefly. I think echoing other people's thoughts about we need funding and support of community-based work to enable it. We've got to pay people for their time, their transportation, and their wisdom. Sorry, distracted by the dog in my background. But the other thing I think we need to build out is the through line to really empower communities to hold this work. I think we've gotten started in inviting communities into kind of defining the work we want to do, the indicators that matter to them, maybe even in some data collection related processes. But then I feel like there's this point where evaluation makes people feel like it's too good for them and they can't do it and they have to hand it off to other people to interpret their wisdom. So I'm like, how do we build local capacity to hold all of the work from beginning to end and not have to call in outsiders who may or may not get it right?
I'd like to piggyback on that because I think that is so important and profound. An example would be, in our work sometimes, and I'll use Native tribes, for example. If you're an outsider coming in and requesting to, do data collection and partner in a certain way with them, it's going to be very, very challenging and difficult. It's already challenging and difficult for those that have established relationships with them. And so in addition to that is just a long history that exists between, the U.S. government, for example, and tribes about how they've used their information and not, to benefit them, but really for their detriment. So, that's just a challenge that, exists out there, not only with that particular population, but, BIPOC populations in general. There's a fear of what are you going to do with that information, my lived experience information, and do I have a say in how that's going to be set up and used? So I think those are some of the challenges, that we face in particular sometimes in the work that we do.
So one of the things that we did as a state health department was we've historically had approved curriculum as one, just one specific area of prevention work that we do. And it's always been, we've done an assessment on what's research-based evidence and put together a list of curriculum that fall within that category, and tell people you could pick from these lists of curriculum to decide which one you want to do. And so we have taken that down from our website. Not all of us have, but my unit has, and we're trying to encourage others to do the same. And instead, what we've created is a guide for programs to use where they can follow the guide to assess their own curriculum. So whether it is a research-based curriculum, another curriculum that is available to them, or a homegrown program or curriculum, they can use the guide, follow the questions throughout the guide to assess the different types of evidence and then make their own decision at the end. And they can use that guide also to share with funders why they came to a decision that it was a good curriculum to use for their community. And the problem is it's long and it's complicated. And like being able to explain to people what the different types of evidence means and provide them information on how to collect that evidence takes more time and effort. So I think we're still deferring to research-based evidence curriculums often, but trying to think about how do we make this an easier process for people to make their own decisions and follow this guide. So we're still working on that.
I think in addition to like the ongoing challenge in government of working around our contracting challenges and restrictions and compensating folks, I've been thinking a lot about how often with community engagement, it feels like we're checking off a box with our efforts, and like how can we better coordinate and align, reduce silos, our like never-ending challenge, like within our own department, but also across state agencies. So community engagement, like our community advisory boards, like listening sessions, that sort of thing is more intentional, feels like it's bi-directional and less extractive. And I don't have like an answer to that, but something that I think, you know, folks are thinking about a lot, at least the ones that I'm working with. But yeah, that's a big challenge.
I am absolutely speaking in mute, but thank you all for sharing and sharing these pressure points that you're having in your work. And I want to piggyback by now asking about the successes that you've seen, and you know, any sort of work that you've done that's adjacent to the principles and the strategies that we've talked about today. And as you've seen these successes in your work, how has it been driving new discoveries and approaches as your work evolves and changes and grows?
Well, a question to me could be is broad. So just thinking about it from the perspective of you know, if you're doing a certain project and you received a grant for it, I think new discoveries have been being able to strategically kind of do some forward thinking about, okay, if we receive this grant, can we build a certain level of foundation with it that would allow us then to utilize from the evaluation component of it for future grants that are similar, so that you can continue those building blocks. Because as some of us were saying earlier, is the challenges of there's not enough dollars, right, or resources to sometimes go with it. So if you think about some forward thinking of saying, if I'm able to demonstrate this, will that set me up, you know, for future funding down the road, and just continue to build from there. I don't know if that makes any sense. In my mind, it does. But I think those are some of the things that have come up, you know, in this thinking process that we're having together, and the work that we've been doing, you know, through our organization, using these principles that are very similar to what we have as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's like sort of, if you're building capacity in one project, how do you take that capacity to the next, or or a network and things like that?
Correct.
So in our work, I would just say so many. Listening to communities has changed the nature of the work that we do. And I would say it moved the work that we do from a position of maintenance to a position of innovation. It changed the conversation, because things that were not seen, noticed, cared about, worked on were brought to the front. And so I'm just thinking about Sierra mentioned during the session her Sidewalks to Sexual Violence Prevention project, where they did community mapping with people with disabilities. And they pointed out, here's what you're not seeing that makes it impossible for me to enter this building, to walk, you know, to roll down this street, to get to work, to get to community, to get to neighbors, to get to benefits, all of the things. So I think listening to community points us to the most important leverage points. And so we use that in our service development, our prevention strategy, and our systems and public policy work. It defines the landscape. And I don't know that there's anything bigger than that.
No worries. Thank you for joining, Bernadette. We appreciate it. No worries. Thank you so much for joining. Awesome. Britt, anything coming to mind for this question or?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I was distracted by the chat. I guess I'm thinking about how like seeing the work documented and elevated provides momentum and justification for why it's so important, and like opens pathways for others to do it. And I guess I'm trying to like think of like a specific example from my department. So my mind was going to the California Reducing Disparities Project, which I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with, but I think that's like a really great example of how they leverage like multi-sector partnerships and funding, local community-driven pilot projects, and then partnered with academic partners to kind of do this braiding that you all were talking about at the beginning of the webinar of like these three evidence. I'm sorry, the word just escaped me. These three types of evidence, correct? And yeah, and I think the CRDP has been like a great example and model for projects across the California Department of Public Health. And they moved from like sort of one-time funding into like general funding, which is also great success. So yeah.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. We're big fans of that project, and we were reading about it also for this project because it does a great job of weaving together, as you were saying, community organizations, government, and academic institutions, which is, you know, opportunities that don't happen often with all three groups of folks. So absolutely, yeah. The last question I have for you both, just reflecting on what we've shared today, is there anything that's sticking out to you, anything that you want to hear more about, learn more about as we put together the broader guide or anything like that? I can also reshare my slides if there's anything you'd want to sort of jog memory and things, but just sort of some parting thoughts on what we've shared, what you want to hear more about. I think that.
I guess something I was thinking about during the presentation about your final report, and when you release that report, who sort of your like priority audiences are for sharing the findings. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, from my understanding, it's sort of a twofold. I think there's one primary audience is the CDC to sort of call attention to, show awareness to. These are the three forms of evidences that you've shared with us. This is why they need to be woven together and have examples and strategies to show how and why we should do that. But I think the other folks are people who are, it's hard because it's like there's so many different sectors and folks who are looking to do this sort of work. So I think there will be a little for institutions and a little for community organizations as they both are sort of understanding, grappling with these four overarching principles, but then the ways in which to sort of do them. And we're hoping to have perspective for both institutions who are hoping to engage in this work and then community organizations who are as well. Yeah.
I'm trying to package all of my thoughts and I'm struggling. And I think my main takeaways are just kind of reiterations of what I've already said, like how we can make community-based evidence and wisdom and leadership more available by supporting it through funding and skill capacity development feels like job one. Job two feels like building up community capacities to hold and own the work, and how we foster trust in community ownership and leadership of the work by involving by bringing in that other component of evidence and external evaluators to to evaluate and tell those stories, because I think our starting point, the belief that external evaluation conducted with other people in another place is relevant for this community, is more bizarre to me than trusting and honoring the wisdom and experience of people where they are. But that doesn't seem to be the status quo. So I think we need to invest in more community-based strategies, evaluate those, tell the stories, so that more and more funders will trust that work, trust to that work.
Thank you so much for both Britt, Colleen, for sharing with us. Colleen, I love the blue on the wall behind you. It's very beautiful.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate this more one-on-one conversation that we were able to have, to weave it into the feedback that we're getting from the webinar today. And as you sort of put together and envision the larger report, it is invaluable what you're sharing. We're really, really appreciative. So thank you so much. We hope that you have the rest of the day. We hope to see you at the next webinar as well. And we'll be in touch for sure. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Okay,
Nice work, you guys.
let me stop this recording.